Hi, Stephen. So nice to meet you somewhat in person.
Hi, Sage, and thanks, Anthony. Great to be here.
Yeah, really great. So just for the people who are tuning in, a bit of the paper we're going to be focusing on today is the problem with intelligence, its value-laden history and the future of AI, and also a bit of the paper Anthony mentioned that I wrote on revisiting smartness in the smart city. So I wanted to start by asking you, Stephen, so what is the issue with intelligence, or the history of intelligence that that begins this sort of problem?
Well, that's a good question, because intelligence is such a common word now. It's such an everyday concept. It's so much a part of not just the technology of AI, but everyday discourse. We assume some people are more intelligent than others, and that matters, and that that's measurable. But all of these ideas are really pretty new. The term intelligence wasn't widely used in English until something like the end of the 19th century. It was quite an obscure term, and it really only rose to prominence with intelligence testing from the start of the 20th century. And then it became hugely important very quickly, because it tied in with a whole lot of other social and political and economic projects. It kind of caught the spirit of the time. The term AI, when it was coined back in 1955, was very much trying to ride on that particular wave. So, the technology we're so used to hearing about now was really emerging from this very particular moment. And, well, there are lots of things to say about what's so special about the concept of intelligence, but I think the first thing to do is just contextualize and problematize it a bit, just to say that, well, actually, for most of recorded history, most of the last, few thousand years, people haven't thought about intelligence in anything like the way we do now.
Yeah, and so what would you consider the big shift, or would you say that that it has come in and out of favor, so to speak? Because yeah, as you've noted, that there were sort of different ways of qualifying people in terms of perhaps genetics, so king to son to whoever else. And then now we've gotten into a kind of society where, in order to justify kind of who's on top, intelligence has come more to play.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest shift is the idea that intelligence is something innate and that you can have to different degrees. So for most of Western philosophy, say, concepts such as mind or reason were much more common. And the idea was that we all had one. We all had one pretty much equally. We've all got a mind. We're all able to use our faculty of reason, for example. And so well into the 19th century, there was an assumption of a kind of basic equality of mental abilities. Darwin, for example, someone would obviously consider to be a genius by today's standards. His work was incredibly important, and who was himself also a very close student of human nature and wrote books about it, considered that humans didn't differ much in intellect. That was his view. When his cousin, Francis Galton, the chap who invented intelligence testing, tried to convince Darwin of that, he was at first skeptical. It seemed surprising to him. So it's extraordinary that now, 150 years later, we take it for granted that people differ in intelligence, and not just that they differ, but that it really matters, that we can test it, with in England, the IQ tests and the 11 plus, in the US with the SATs, and so on, all over the world, different variations on IQ test are used, and these matter for people's lives. What schools they get into, what colleges, what jobs they get, and so on. So this idea that intelligence really matters, that it's identifiable, that people differ, that it's measurable, and that people should then be put into their place in society because of it, is really radical and has quite shallow roots.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I wonder, to the extent that, well, of course, not only colonization, but globalization and this fight for quote unquote equality that we're still so far away from comes to play in this, because I feel like historically there's been a assumption when we talk about all people that the all people are those who are already of a certain social status or level. So you know, in the US Constitution, like all men under God, of course, it doesn't include a lot of individuals in that. So I wonder, and I think you also state a bit in your paper, the extent to which it's very, intelligence has been used as a way to justify segregation and sexism, and basically justify these systems that continue to benefit, quote unquote, what the ruling class or the ruling population.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Intelligence has, since its resurgence in the early 20th century, has been part of what the great scholar of race and gender, Patricia Hill Collins, called hegemonic ideology. You know, that is a way of thinking that really cements existing power relations and makes them seem natural. So intelligence is this quasi-scientific concept that promises us a way of measuring people and allotting them. But it just turns out when we do that, that actually we maintain the social order as it is, that, you know, privileged white men with money and education, etc., come out on top, and those who are already disenfranchised and marginalized come out at the bottom. So, you know, it proves to be a way of maintaining the status quo and legitimating it. Now, that has very, very ancient roots. Having said that, this explosion in interest in intelligence is quite recent. The idea that mental ability can be used to support that kind of social status quo is one that has roots in ancient Greek philosophy, and in particular Aristotle. Plato already introduced something like the idea with his philosopher king. That is, you know, and it was quite radical when Plato was proposing the idea that the ideal ruler was someone who was the smartest, effectively. Plato didn't use a word that translates directly as intelligence or smartness, but he talked about quick to learn, lover of the truth, good memory, you know, this kind of thing. And Plato suggested it's this person who should rule over the others because they're wiser. Just one generation later, his pupil Aristotle has really embraced this and is using it to justify the status quo. There's this really notorious passage in his book Politics, where he's saying that, you know, some people are born to rule, others are born to be ruled over. Reason is the ability that sets apart those who are born to rule, and we find it in educated, privileged men. You know, they have a right to rule over working class men who work with their hands, and over women, and over non-human animals, you know, because of this inborn rule. So just one generation after Plato introduces the idea, we see Aristotle using it as a hegemonic ideology, in other words, as a way to justify effectively what was the status quo and the privilege of a few in Athens. Now that subsides for, you know, nearly 2,000 years as Christianity is completely antithetical to that ideology. And, you know, the Christian virtues like piety and charity and knowing your place in society in a certain way dominate well into the Middle Ages. But then interest in this kind of use of mental ability to establish hierarchies really grows again with colonialism. And so, you know, to your point about taking a global perspective, you know, globalization has, of course, had many waves, and colonization, European colonization of other countries from, you know, the 17th through to the 20th century is the one that has probably shaped our world more than any other. And what might have started as an economic enterprise quickly required a kind of political and moral justification to underpin the kind of exploitation and genocide that was involved. And Aristotle's argument that certain people were just born to rule proved very attractive as a justification. And so what we see in the kind of ideology of colonialism is a mixing together of the ideas of civilization and intelligence and technological prowess, and those being used to justify domination of other people. It's like, you know, we are the most sophisticated, we're the ones who best know how to use the land, how best to regulate society, we have the highest morals. and therefore we must either, eradicate or educate these savages. And it really is from that colonial moment, with that kind of discourse between civilization and savagery, civilization and nature, with intelligence as well, before the word came into common currency, but with mental ability being used, obviously purported mental ability, but there was no justification, scientific justification for this. It's from this that the concept of intelligence testing really emerges in the late 19th century.
Yeah, it's interesting too how it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, because whoever can create whatever intelligence means can then test it and then continue to define who is intelligent, as you also write in these college entrance exams, to create a process of continually getting one subset of society admitted. I've also found in the smart city that we have sort of a similar issue where, in order to fix a problem, it has to be justified, and it's always justified from a certain group. So if you're from perhaps a disability community or a lower income community, what you know is right for your community is not always seen as the truth, or seen as valid, or seen as smart, because smartness is defined by the city or the corporations that then define the space, which I think is a good transition to kind of the apex, I guess, so to speak, of your article, in terms of the connection between intelligence and then AI. So could you speak a little bit about this connection? How did AI sort of become AI, and what are some of the problems associated with calling AI and deriving its value with the term intelligence?
Yeah, so the term AI, as you know, was coined in 1955 by computer scientist John McCarthy in the US. And at that time, intelligence testing was very widespread. There's a wonderful satire of it. Kurt Vonnegut, who's very famous for his novel Slaughterhouse-Five, his first novel, Player Piano, is effectively a satire of this idea that people can be sort of, given a number and that determines their place in society. But it was a very powerful idea at the time. It was reaching its height, if you like. And so it was in that context where the concept of intelligence had, then for 60 or 70 years been systematically used to justify colonialism, gender inequality too, of course, existing social hierarchies between the more privileged and the working class and so on. The term AI was coined. Now, what was John McCarthy trying to do? Well, essentially, when he coined the phrase, which he did, as many of our listeners will probably know, for a workshop. He wanted to get funding for a workshop to hold at Dartmouth, where he planned to solve all the problems of getting machines to think, if you like, getting machines to replicate human cognitive functions. And he needed a name for this. Well, there were lots of names at the time. I mean, computing was, people were starting to get excited about computing. And there were established traditions in automata studies and in cybernetic theory and neural engineering, information studies, and so on. And McCarthy knew very well about all of these. And he worked closely with some of the really key people in the field. Like he'd just finished a collaboration with Claude Shannon, who'd invented information theory. But McCarthy was frustrated that none of these existing traditions were really capturing people's imagination in the way that he thought the field could. And so when he coined the phrase artificial intelligence, he was consciously breaking with the established technical traditions of his time. He was saying this is not just a continuation of cybernetics or information theory or neural engineering. This is something new. And it wasn't just, and it wasn't even an invention or something he was naming. It was an aspiration that he was naming. It was the aspiration to create machines that can equal or surpass us in cognitive ability. Now, AI has struggled with this term ever since. And as you know, there have been these so-called AI winters, or these massive, rising waves of hype around AI and then huge crashes. And right now, we've been seeing in the last few years a huge increase in interest in AI. But the reason for these enormous hype waves is that the description, the term AI never referred to an actual technology. It was always referring to an aspiration, and it never connected to any underlying technology. So in a sense, AI's never really been a science. And you could say the same about intelligence, of course, the term that it was hijacking in order to get more attention. So AI still suffers from this problem. I think this is, perhaps the first time in history where we have a technology that some people are saying is absolutely everywhere and is changing everything, and some people are saying doesn't exist at all. I mean, it's extraordinary. How can we be in this position? You will get serious people who are arguing there's no such thing as AI because machines aren't really intelligent. And you'll read 10 times a day that AI is at the same time changing everything. So what is this telling us about this term and about the underlying, ideologies that have motivated it? I mean, there are lots of interesting things to say about that and what that means for the AI hype wave. But what I focus on in that paper is how the importation of this very ideologically laden concept of intelligence might be shaping what we worry about or hope for when we think about AI.
Yeah, so basically all the stereotypes and assumptions and the creation of intelligence that we've made and defined has been sort of carried over by giving the term intelligence as well to this whole field of science that's doing a lot of different things. And I can see the ways that can impact both people in society who are thinking about dealing with or working with artificial intelligence, and also the sort of systems that it would cause us to create. So also in my work, I've talked a bit about what are we actually using AI for, because it's often lauded as a system that will kind of save everything, or that it will, improve the planet, improve society. But often, for example, in the smart city context, we'll say that we want a smart city to improve something like sustainability or transportation, but it's very rarely applied to increasing gender equality or making it better for people with various disabilities or increasing education levels. But this technology that can supposedly be used to solve all ills is very much being applied in very specific manners that carry over the same, perhaps, biases and intentionality that the meaning of intelligence gave us in the first place. And I found it really interesting in your paper, you talk a bit about who feels like they have access to be part of AI and artificial intelligence. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as we've discussed already, the concept of intelligence was really invented in its modern form by a white male privileged elite, largely to defend their privilege. Not always consciously, of course, but sometimes. And when it wasn't explicit, then I think it was at least unconscious. What does that mean for when we think about AI now and the field of AI? Well, AI is emerging from a space that already has serious problems with gender and racial bias. And I mean, fields, both academic fields and industrial sectors, vary, of course, in the kind of values and attributes that they prize most. But computer science and philosophy are both disciplines that prize a certain idea of brilliance, of high intellect, if you like. And I think what's particularly insidious about this in computer science is the kind of myth that the code doesn't lie. Like if you're a brilliant coder, you're coding away, the computer doesn't care if you're privileged or not. So there's a kind of myth of egalitarianism around computer science, but it just so happens that the vast majority of computer scientists are white males. So where and what studies have revealed is biases that are affecting every aspect of like the pipeline in computer science, from, you know, the kind of media we grow up surrounded by that shows computer scientists as white men. My colleagues and I in my center recently did a survey we'll be publishing soon of the most influential films featuring AI in some form over the last 100 years. So you can use, you know, fairly standard criteria of influentialness around sort of highest grossing and most referred to and that kind of thing. And how do they portray AI scientists, AI engineers? And of course, the answer is predominantly as men. I think I don't have the exact figures with me, but we're about 140 significant portrayals of AI scientists, and 7 of them are women. So we're talking about a tiny percentage. And even those, their men are bosses. Their bosses are men. So even where women are shown. So, you know, and of course we're growing up surrounded by the sense that computer scientists, which is of course where AI engineers are coming from, are male. This affects the extent to which women might want to go into the field. It affects their confidence and their ability and so on. And then of course, even if they overcome all of those obstacles and want to enter the field, it affects the hiring panel, who are sitting there thinking, well, you don't look like a brilliant AI scientist to me. You're not a young white man in a hoodie, you know. And then it of course affects workplace culture. If women do successfully get through all of those many barriers, then there are all sorts of ways in which they're systematically undermined once they're in those companies, and their confidence undermined, and they're not given the most interesting work and ability to prove themselves, and so on. And so all of that pre-exists in computer science and among other fields. Now, if you introduce into that the kind of rebranding of everything as artificial intelligence and the fetishization of intelligence that comes with it, then of course we have a kind of perfect storm where we're introducing now as the central concept in the future of computer science, a concept that is also traditionally heavily associated with a privileged white male elite. And even though, you know, we might be glad that the worst days of colonization and eugenics and so on, where intelligence was explicitly used to justify genocide, you know, 100 years ago, those, you know, worst days are behind us. But still, there are many studies that show that people have clear prejudices about who is not intelligent, and so of course this is significantly impacting who gets to shape the field of AI.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting how when you brought up figures and who's seen as intelligent, it's also interesting to me what is stripped away from intelligence. So a lot of these sort of white male figures are also quite lacking in emotional intelligence, even in the films. Like you watch the Steve Jobs film, very clear, Mark Zuckerberg, that there's a feeling that you're allowed to be intelligent and be lacking clear characteristics that we connect to being a good human, being a good caretaker, and that those things that are perhaps more associated with femininity, that aren't, you know, upper class work sort of skills, are even taken away from intelligence, because that's how much that intelligence has to be on a single plane. So I also find it quite interesting. You, I think, also mentioned in your paper the sort of infamous Google memo that was sent out by the one engineer who was complaining about all the sort of diversity and, you know, training and work, and saying that, you know, that there are inherent differences and things, that often those differences are very much targeted and undervalued. So I actually was I did my bachelor's degree in computer science at Stanford University, and one of my professors pointed out in a faculty meeting, she brought up that there has to be more work done to work with sort of all of the sexual harassment happening in the department. And one of the other heads of the department, who were mainly all male, she was one of the few female faculty members, said, oh, nothing like that happens, because he had never heard of it and no one had ever come to him about it. And she's like, every day I have a student coming to me, but people were only coming to her because she was the only one who people could see were intelligent enough, if we're including that in intelligence, to deal with the issue. So it's very clear to see how that can sort of seep into AI, and I find it really interesting with tools like Grammarly or BetterHelp. There's these new wave AI tools, and how they seem to be almost more connected with humanness than intelligent. Like, we're still not connecting this sort of intelligence with things other than those that were created in the past century or so.
Yeah, it's extraordinary how dominant a particular idea of intelligence became, and the kind of claims that about the importance of AI now rest on that assumption about the importance of a particular kind of intelligence, like, AI is the most important technology, it's going to save us from everything, as you were saying earlier. And this is a widespread idea promoted by powerful and important, smart people, that AI is the ultimate technology. Because intelligence itself is the ultimate virtue, and everything we've accomplished because of intelligence. And that is a claim that throughout most of human history would have seemed utterly absurd. If you'd asked someone 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, whether in this country or in China or whatever, what they think the most important virtues were, they'd mention all sorts of things around, teamwork, piety, or determination, will, wisdom, experience, all sorts of things. Only some of which are sort of tangentially related to the idea of intelligence that we now fetishize, which isn't to say that it's important, of course, but it isn't the only virtue, and focusing on it to the exclusion of all else is harmful for all sorts of reasons. But in particular, and so it feeds into this long-standing ideology that puts intelligence in a kind of binary, in a kind of opposition to ideas associated more with femininity.
Yeah, I wanted to jump to kind of a separate point, but that's along the same line, that I think is a really interesting point that you make in your paper about how there's this sort of fear for AI sort of taking over and taking over, quote unquote, white collar jobs, or taking over law jobs. Yet we have this current issue already where truck drivers, fear with the increase of self-driving technology. Truck driving is one of the very large population of, at least the American workforce, are truck drivers. So that's a job that's going away. Retail work with things like Amazon, but the big fear is with these sort of intelligent jobs. So I thought that was a really interesting point to sort of like end your paper on.
Yeah, thank you. So indeed, it matters how we talk about these technologies, because it shapes what we do with them and what we think they can do and what we worry about, and the kind of policies we develop and so on. And I think this is an example. If we are worried that suddenly machines are going to become super intelligent, super smart, then we worry about all the people who are doing things we think are intelligent and super smart, and all the smart people, and what it means for them. And we have a crisis focused on the impact on effectively middle-class professional jobs that have been, where things like intelligence tests have been used as the gateways, and which are generally associated with smartness. So we have a lot of attention, and particularly when this hype wave started around 2016. We have a lot of attention on what does it mean for doctors, what does it mean for lawyers, what does it mean for professionals. Previous waves of automation have hit manual labor, this one will hit cognitive labor, this one will hit the middle classes, the professions, and so on. And that hasn't really happened. I mean, of course, it will change those professions a bit, but I don't think we really need to worry right now about a swathe of unemployed lawyers. On the contrary, I think they'll do very well out of AI. Whereas if we cast the same technology in a different light, if we, instead of talking about AI, said, well, we're going to automate large amounts of public services, then what we'd be worried about is instead the people who use those public services. We'd be worried about, instead people who are poor, people who are disabled, we'd be worried about pensioners. And so, it puts the focus on a wholly different demographic. And another predominant fear, of course, in the media and to some extent in popular press is that of an AI takeover. And, again, this is a concern that arises from the very particular way in which intelligence has been used in the past to justify dominance hierarchies. So, if you're a white male in a privileged position, as I am, obviously, then, and you think you deserve to be there because you're very, very intelligent, that's why I'm at the University of Cambridge, I fully, completely deserve my position. Then what you might be worried about is machines that come along and are even more intelligent and suddenly seem to be a threat to me. And effectively, what we have for people in positions of privilege like that is a kind of dilemma, sort of either they have to give up the idea that intelligence justifies a position at the top of a dominance hierarchy, or hand over our position at the top to the machines.
Yeah.
Hence, it tends to be, and I'm not the person to put, someone called Kate Crawford, who wrote in the New York Times a few years ago that the people who are worried about AI takeover tend to be, white men in positions of privilege predominantly, because everyone else in the world is already worried about being oppressed by, people who claim to be superior to them.
Yeah, I think that might be a good note to start moving on to some of our Q&A questions. So if people have questions, of course, that we haven't touched on, feel free to add them to the Q&A. I'll start with a question from Chris Belshaw. He asks, intelligence as a term might be new, but being clever, isn't this notion long-standing and variation significant?
Yeah, different cultures have different notions of clever and what it means and what it implies. So, for example, if you take the Iliad and the Odyssey, then Odysseus is regularly described as cunning, and he's clearly portrayed as the smart one. Like if they have a tricky problem and they need a tricky answer, they go to Odysseus, and he of course comes up with the idea of the Trojan horse. But it's sort of associated with a certain kind of craftiness and, as I say, cunning. And it isn't implied that he's sort of superior in some way, but there's no implication that he'd be a better ruler, say, than Agamemnon, who has immense will and experience and charisma and a certain kind of wisdom. Obviously he makes a sort of catastrophic mistake in it, attacking Troy, but he's portrayed as a great leader for having other qualities. Or Achilles, of course, who is also a sort of minor king, who is also portrayed as great, who isn't portrayed as in the least bit bright, but he's great for completely different reasons, for other virtues, the virtues of the warrior and so on. So yes, I think every culture has ways of recognizing differences in mental ability, but they're not seen as unilinear in the way that the idea of general intelligence assumes. They're not necessarily seen as, therefore, sort of, measurable in a straightforward way, and they're not seen to imply, they should determine someone's standing in the world. So I think with the rise of the concept of intelligence in the 19th and 20th century, brought together a whole set of different implications that weren't there previously with terms like sort of clever or cunning or whatever.
Yeah, that makes sense. So basically you're saying there have always been concepts of smartness or cleverness, but there was kind of this, what's the word, operationalism of them, so, or measurement of intelligence that became new with this age of empiricism that wasn't quite there before, wasn't there in the same way. So you couldn't, have an SAT or IQ test that then would put one group against another.
And I think the qualities were much more ambivalent. The idea of being clever was associated with cunning, which could be a virtue in certain circumstances, but is also problematic. There's something tricky about it. Like you might want someone in your team who's clever in that sense to help you solve a particular problem, but you might not, because it might be destabilizing, or maybe they're not trustworthy, or it's good. So it doesn't. These aren't manifest virtues of overriding importance in the way that intelligence came to be.
I'll move on to the next question. So Tia Jackson asks, there is a sense that intelligence modeled on computers is rooted in a gendered ideal or fantasy of intellectual life as pure information processing. But is any other kind of computer AI intelligence even possible? Doesn't the technology limit the kinds of intelligence that are possible in this domain?
Yeah, I think, well, those are two really interesting questions. One is what kind of things can computers do? And the other is then what does that mean for how we think about AI? I mean, it might be that AI can only do certain specific things that we would associate with a certain kind of cleverness, a certain kind of reasoning. Okay, that might well be, although that's actually, I mean, it also might not be. I mean, there are lots of people pursuing all sorts of forms of computing that are not for kind of classic logical reasoning. And in fact, of course, the revolution that we're experiencing in AI is based on machine learning, which is a sort of statistical reasoning, which is very different to the sort of logical reasoning that people assumed in the 20th century. Well, not everyone, but a lot of people assumed in the 20th century would lead to AI. So, there are different paradigms, and people are very interested in what's sometimes called affective computing. That is the way in which computing can sort of read and model emotion and so on. And of course, the whole tradition in robotics that is really opposed to the disembodied idea of reason that for some people is a kind of ideal, again, associated with the IQ test, and instead are completely convinced that embodiment is crucial to realizing intelligence. So I think there are different paradigms, but even if there weren't, say, what does that, when it's only because we've called this thing artificial intelligence and we think intelligence is so important for humanity that we want it to do everything and be everything. I mean, we don't have to think of it like that. If we discover that, we could only use computers to do something very specific, then we say, okay, well, let's stop calling it artificial intelligence and just call them calculators or whatever. Well, ironically, calculators were once humans. I have a sort of great aunt who was a calculator. But if we see them in these narrower terms, we might both better describe what they do and better manage our hopes and fears and expectations around them.
Yeah, I think I would also add on to what you said, saying that I personally don't really think that machine learning is intelligent. I mean, similar to, as you said, even in the traditional sense. So, we've moved away from symbolic systems, but if you look at now, there's systems where you type in a caption and then a picture is generated, and nothing about that is necessarily logical. I think if an artist did that, people wouldn't say that makes them intelligent necessarily. So I think the fact that machine learning is being applied to more types of systems that we don't necessarily qualify or as intelligent is also might lead to opening up the domain, but we are still sort of stuck with this term. So I'd also argue that a lot of the solutions that we come up with in smart cities aren't necessarily smart either. Like the sensors break down, the technology can't recognize if a sensor is working or not. So like intelligent isn't even necessarily the best term for what people are currently up to.
And machine creativity is a really interesting case, but I think because we're ascribing intelligence to the machine, which we see as a very general, powerful faculty, we're worried about machine creativity. We're asking questions, can machines be creative? Are they going to put artists out of work and so on? Whereas instead, if we saw this as a tool, then we could instead be asking questions about how is this going to enhance human creativity? How is it going to create new paradigms? How is it going to create a step change? And of course, there'll still be anxieties around that, just like the invention of photography caused a great deal of anxiety among visual artists, sort of that they were going to become redundant, and some of them did. But also, of course, it didn't, the invention of photography didn't end visual arts. It spurned abstractionism, expressionism, impressionism, and all sorts of exciting movements, and became an art form in itself. And I think a lot of what machine learning does now, if we just see it as a tool that's going to help us move to the next level in all sorts of domains of human endeavor, we're going to be less anxious and more positive about it, and be able to sort of better situated in our lives than if we ascribe intelligence to it.
I'll move on to the next question from, I'm sorry, I might butcher your first name, Greme Tiffany, who asks, AI relies on data. Marginalized people are more likely to use public rather than private services. So AI systems know a lot about them and little about those who create those systems. Can you comment on data ethics implications?
Yeah, well, there are a huge amount of challenge. I mean, that's a really important area. Of course, there are certain communities that have a long history of being over surveilled, of sort of not getting attention when they want it, you know, take me seriously, I want this job, but being systematically monitored by the state, by police forces and so on. It's, of course, you know, African-American community in the US, for example, where they might find that there's an awful lot of data when it comes to, you know, crime in communities where they live, which means that they're much more likely to be targeted by predictive policing, because they live in areas that have been historically over-policed and over-surveilled, and much less data when it comes to, for example, you know, delivering them appropriate products via recommendation systems or some sort of, you know, give them successful credit ratings. So it's a huge problem, yeah, that, you know, exactly because machine learning systems are data dependent and data is historic, they effectively replicate and exacerbate historic biases. And I mean, that's a huge challenge for the field. I mean, Sage, you probably have much more experience with this, working with this than I do.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's a very interesting question, and also interesting too how it's focused a bit more on quote unquote industrialized nations, because of course we have areas where people don't even have access to internet in the same ways that I assume most people who are here in the Zoom do. So on one hand, yes, for instance, in the smart city context in a quote unquote industrialized nation, depending on how, I guess, equal the society is, so how comfortable everyone feels taking public transport. So I think you get a big difference in different countries in Europe versus the US, where it really, the social classes that use public transportation are much more separate than in a place like the Netherlands, for example. But yeah, there has been, so it's interesting because there's different opinions on this question. So some people say, okay, the solution is just to surveil everyone equally. So you'll have people who are from minority backgrounds who are like, okay, I'm fine, because then people know I'm good, I'm okay if everyone's like at least surveilled equally. But yeah, I agree. It's a challenging concept, but I think it's not as extreme to the point that you might think. I think in the US, yeah, maybe so, because there is an extreme difference in terms of who uses public space where, but I think a lot of the places where smart technologies are put, so if you think of the internet, not everyone has their own VPN yet. So maybe in the future, maybe if we're thinking about a future society where people are more concerned about public intervention and privacy surveillance, then I think your point might become more extreme. But I think at the current moment, the bigger issue, or what people are more concerned about, are the inequalities between quote unquote like the global north and global south in terms of because there will be people from lower income populations who even in New York City don't have the same access to internet, and so then it's still those who are higher class in society have more wealth who are actually being processed more. Or if you are an immigrant, then perhaps you're not registered in all the government services. So this, even with like low technology solutions, so if you think of the census, people aren't registered the way that they should be, and it's typically, so if people want to be registered and it's helpful for them, they'll find a way in. Other people are sometimes registered when it's not useful for them against their will. I'll move on to the next question. So Jason Benton asks, at university, they teach truth is only based on interpretation. In the courtroom, truth as an absolute is still highly valued. I hear resemblance to this idea when people discuss intelligence. The difference has high social consequences. Comment.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understood that question, but I'll say some things that it makes me think about, and about, please clarify the question if I'm not, if what I'm saying is not relevant. But I think, what's interesting about the concept of intelligence is the role it plays both in scientific discourse and certainly in the 20th century to a large extent in policy discourse, where it was, as I say, assumed that it was real, that it was, as I say, unilinear, that everyone had it to a certain degree, and that it could be measured scientifically, and that mattered for society. So there were a lot of assumptions about what was objectively real, if you like, in that context. But in fact, it was being used to justify a particular ideology, and the way then the sort of measures of what were purported to be this objective truth were created always came out to defend the, well, not always, but I mean very often to defend the status quo, as you know, Sage mentioned before. So IQ tests were developed. I mean, really, the first IQ test was in France, but they were really developed in the US. It's when they crossed the Atlantic to the US that they started to be significantly developed and deployed. And they were developed by you know, a few academics who were all eugenicists. They were literally members of the Eugenics Association, and some of them were motivated to keep the elite universities of the US white and keep immigrants out. There was a very active worry at the time, Jewish immigrants in particular, but others too. And the tests that they developed, thinking what they were doing was objective science, assumed, you know, the kind of education you would have had if you belonged to a certain social class in a particular bit of the US. So, you know, they were claiming objectivity for something that was deeply value-laden, both, you know, to an extent consciously and to an extent unconsciously. And so the kind of critique that my paper does, which is, you know, just one of many different ways of doing philosophy, and probably not even the most common, but perhaps more common in things like gender theory or critical race theory and so on, is about saying, well, let's not take this concept at face value. Let's not just say, what does it mean? Let's not say, what does it, you know, there are lots of papers out there trying to define intelligence, but instead it's asking, well, what is the term intelligence doing here? What work is it doing in society, politically? What work is it doing? And that's a different kind of critique. It's similar to what in the continent is called deconstruction. In the analytic tradition, it has a sort of names like assessing the value-ladenness of concepts. So it's a sort of big movement in science and technology studies at the moment, of the value-ladenness of the concepts that we use. So that's the kind of critique which I suppose is trying to challenge things that we might think are objective or straightforward or in the world ready to be measured.
I think I just add on to that yeah, in the field of epistemology, there's lots of viewpoints on what knowledge is and what truth is. And so I mentioned a bit of like standpoint epistemology, which is based on that there is no kind of one set truth of the world or one set knowledge. And you'll even see in a lot of academic papers, even in the sciences, with various, you know, you need like below a p-value of a certain amount, and one test works out, and then years later, the experiment turns out, you know, backtrack. So in this world where we think we know a lot, there's a lot that we don't really know, and depending on where you are in society, you are affected by different experiences, and you have the truth of those experiences that you can witness and know. So I, for example, identify as an able-bodied person. People are less likely to identify by your quote unquote positive or normal characteristics, even though they define you more than you would expect. So if I was quote unquote disabled, I'd probably more strongly identify as being disabled as much as I identify as being like a Black or a woman. And that those experiences kind of shape a truth that someone who doesn't have those labels will never be able to experience. Or never really fully know. And so there's this theory or idea that perhaps the more marginalized different individuals are in society, the more knowledge they can actually experience or know, because they not only experience their truthiness, but they're also set in this world that is based on the truthiness of whoever at the given time is the normal in society. So I think we always have to be a little bit wary when we think of intelligence or truth, not to demonize science. I'm, in academia, and I'm very much a big fan of science and quote unquote truth. But there is also the fear of overvaluing one set standard of truthiness in society, where there's certain facts that can only be recognized if you are in that experience. There are other facts, of course, everyone given the information should be able to know or figure out. I think that's a separate issue, but I'd add that to your point. I think we're about out of time. Is there any last statements that you would like to add, Stephen?
Well, just to pick up on those last comments of yours, Sage, which I think were so important. And, I'm sometimes asked why I, as a white man, am interested in things like gender theory and critical race theory, which is, as if I only ought to be reading philosophy written by other white men, But of course, the assumption behind that isn't that white men only ought to read works by white men. The assumption is that works by white men are kind of universally true and interesting, whereas works by women in gender theory are only of interest to women. And of course that's not true, and it's not true for the just the reasons you were spelling out, Sage. I think for awfully long time philosophy was written only by white men, and it comes from a very particular point of view. And I think some of the most exciting works in theory of all kind, not just philosophy, but across the board, has come from gender theory and critical race theory, from people who felt excluded from the system that had been constructed by the white male philosophers, and have pointed out its many flaws and the many other ways of looking at the world. And those for me are extremely compelling ways towards new truths.
Thanks. Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel so one thing that I like to bring up too is when people talk about why we need women or people of color or XYZ marginal group, people often feel the need to point out like, it will better the value of the corporation, or and not even think about that those groups are actually the majority in society, and that we can all learn from them, and to normalize kind of a new normalization of what it means to be intelligent, that will kind of make us all a bit smarter with time, hopefully.